Thanks, Jonathan. I should have said at the outset as well, thanks for inviting me. I mean, all these forums, big or small, are really valuable. And the more of them that are happening, the better. Just to answer a couple of them quick ones. The Vienna one, I think, that I think it was Orla had mentioned. I think I saw the same show, and like Vienna is a really good example. I think it's not perfect. There are aspects of it you would probably do differently in Ireland, but the core concept of the state or your local authority providing through the local authority, providing you with secure, affordable housing, that is a normal way for someone to live. That's the key point. And it's actually the figure, I think it's maybe 64-65%, but it's actually climbing. It's getting higher. The people over the years have opted out of private rental or have chosen to never to bother going near private rental or private purchase. One of the things just really, I mean, and again, just touched on this point that was made there about social housing, like the term. So social housing has been the term really in this state always that I've known. We launched, along with the WP and the CPI, launched the campaign for public housing about 4 years ago. And one of the sort of objectives we set in that was to try and shift the language away from talking about social housing to public housing. Public has a particular, well, we thought the word public, right, had a singular meaning, i.e. publicly owned, publicly controlled, publicly supplied, right? So we thought, yeah, let's go with this thing called public housing. And people can go look at the timelines and go look at when did people like Conor McCabe start talking about public housing, when did people like Richard Boyd Barrett start talking about public housing, and when did Owen Murphy start talking about public housing and public land, right? Because that's the day before the last general election. He stood in a field in Ringsend with doing a little video to camera where he said he wants to see public housing on public land on the down in Ringsend, right? So we wanted to shift the language, and to some extent we did. From whenever that campaign started, it kind of kick-started the Coalition for Housing and Homeless Coalition, which had been somewhat moribund and doing nothing for about 12 months. It suddenly roared into life and started calling protests and releasing press releases. And lo and behold, it started talking about public housing, right? So we thought you could kind of shift it. But what actually happened is the word public housing has now, to some extent, become corrupted. And what they're doing is interchanging social and public as if they're the same thing, right? So a lot of, you'll hear, if you listen a little more, maybe a little more acute, more tuned in to this aspect of it, you'll often hear now an Owen O'Brien or Richard Boyd Barrett or a Leo Varadkar or a Micheál Martin, whoever it is, talking about housing, and they will interchange the word public and social throughout a single interview, right? And this is an important point, is that what they've done is they are now in the south here. I mean, someone asked, well, what is it like? In the south, they're using the two terms interchangeably, right? You're interchanging social and public, but they're also saying, like, for example, if you're on the housing list in the south, waiting for your council to give you a house, and you go and secure in the private market, you go and find a private landlord, and you come back to your council, say, I found a landlord here, I want to pay the landlord, we'll pay them through the HAP scheme, the housing assistance payments, right? You are then deemed to have had your social housing needs met, and you're taken off the housing list, okay? So if you look at the housing lists in the south, they've gone from like 90,000 down to, I don't know, maybe it's 40 or 50,000 now. So on paper, it looks like, oh, Jesus, look at all the social housing they must have built, but they're not. What they've done is they now deem, if you're in the private rental sector, with the state paying your rent or paying a high proportion section of your rent to your landlord, your housing needs are now deemed to have been met. And what you're in, so when the state releases figures, and the government releases figures saying that we have increased the amount of social housing by 20,000. 12,000 or 14,000 that could be HAP leases with private landlords, right? So the words have become corrupted, and we have now gone. This is why we're now, a couple of years ago, rebranded our own campaign as universal public housing, right? We actually had to put the word universal in front of public to make it absolutely clear that the type of public housing we're talking about is not the public housing that Owen Murphy is talking about or that Micheál Martin is talking about, because the word is actually now, we thought by kind of encouraging that word into the public discourse, it would mean something. But in fact, they just took the word and corrupted it. The point about social housing as well, just an important one about the Vienna. Remember where social housing came from in this state. Social housing in this state, I can't speak with authority about the northern housing situation. It was the dynamic sectarian allocation of housing, and then the way in which housing was then used through the housing executive funds. It's a different kind of reality. But in this state, essentially what they had done, from the 1970s onwards, was housing was increasingly privatized through the sell-off of state-owned housing and through the deregulation of banking and mortgages and so on. And so that housing, the norm became that you would rent your house. So from sort of the 70s on, even this, it's a common mistake that people believe that Conor, I think, highlighted this in his book, and probably maybe that's where I first heard it, was that Thatcher kind of introduced the privatization of housing, and that we follow them. In fact, Haughey introduced in the 1966 budget legislative changes that standardised the right to buy your council house. So it's that far back, the process of privatising housing. But what had happened by the 80s, certainly into the 70s, 80s, social housing was increasingly becoming for the lower part of the working class, right? And as time moved on, housing really, because the banks and the builders and the developers and the land speculators and the estate agents and the solicitors and all of the other parasites are able to make money out of private housing, out of selling private housing. The bit that was left over, the people who had not got the means to buy housing, were allocated social housing. So this was like the section of society that the landlords, the land speculators, the bankers, the estate agents, and the gambling men had not figured out a way to squeeze money out of them. And they couldn't, so they weren't part of that. The residue that was left over, the 8, 9, 10% on very low incomes, people on social welfare. So social housing from the sort of 70s onward increasingly became not mixed income areas or kind of working class, but it became social housing of those on social welfare, of those on extremely low incomes. And what you got then is a concentration of poverty. People are poor for particular reasons. A lot of people have low incomes for particular reasons, right? So what you end up in these estates is they start to become, particularly in Dublin, they become areas of concentrations of poverty. And with a concentration of poverty come a concentration of the problems associated with poverty, the reasons why people are poor and the reasons why people stay poor. And of course, that's linked to economics, it's linked to class, but it also then becomes concentrations with substance abuse issues, people who are poor because they have a substance abuse issue, or they remain poor because they can't shake it. Therefore, you end up with drug dealings, and drug problems, and drug gangs, and all that. So suddenly, if the social housing becomes somewhere where an awful lot of people in this state do not want to live, right? It becomes pariah, it becomes stigmatized, and essentially becomes the bad areas in Dublin, right? And in lots in all the main cities. So if you have a bad area, you also have a good area. And of course, this suits the developers. This suits speculative housing model, the model of speculative housing. It suits those who want to hype up the price of housing in particular areas. So they're complex. The roots of this stuff go back decades. And what we're dealing with today took decades. It took decades to get to the situation we're in now. And it will take years and years and years to solve. And Vienna started on their housing project with Red Vienna in the 1920s and 1930s. So it took them decades to solve it because they had a terrible housing crisis in Vienna in that period. And left-wing forces turned it around. And now today, they're still a century later are reaping the benefits of it. So social housing in this state has failed, and it was designed to fail. It was designed to create areas which were that social housing would never be cost effective, that social housing would never pay for itself, to use that phrase, and that it would essentially create kind of ghettos and undesirable areas where all of the problems of the cities could be thrown so that other private estates could flourish in value and accumulate in value. And that's, so housing here, it's linked to class issues, it's linked to sort of social engineering, policing issues, and it's all interrelated. On the issue of building, what we do with governments, and I finish this, moving forward, I mean, to me, the big successful campaigns of recent years, and the most recent being the Eighth Amendment, they reached a critical mass through building popular support, and the political parties followed where the support was, right? So if you look at the run-in to the Eighth Amendment, like Fine Gael, in fairness to Fine Gael, that younger kind of cohort of leaders, the kind of the Varadkars, Simon Harris and so on, they kind of went into a pro-choice position, or at least a repeal the eighth position relatively early. Sinn Féin waited until the referendum had been called, unless I'm mistaken, before they came out with a definitive position. And Fianna Fáil kind of half said, like Martin said yes, and a lot of Fianna Fáil said no, right? But the point is that they had shifted. The campaign deliberately targeted the political class, but also it was directly communicating with people on the ground through, you know, stories like in her shoes, through all these sort of, through social media, through the lived experience of women in this country. The ground was shifting in favour of the campaign. And the campaign went ahead of the parties, and the parties then had to play catch up. Once the opinion polls started to emerge, in fact, the big turning point in that campaign was the Citizens' Assembly. When the Citizens' Assembly came out and said, hang on, actually, the Citizens' Assembly of 100 people is arguing, yeah, the Eighth Amendment has to go. And at that point, it was like all of the establishment politicians went, whoa, hang on. We thought this issue was poison to touch. We thought if we went for a yes or advocated for the end of the Eighth Amendment, we'd be lost. The Irish people would never go for it. And lo and behold, the people were going for it, and the political class followed. And I think with housing, it's going to have to be the same thing. I think it's going to have to be high, you know, and it's not as simple as the Eighth Amendment. It's not as simple as the water tax. It is an inherently complex issue. It is simple in one way. In one way, it's really simple, like, you know, but there are loads of dimensions to it, and loads of angles in it, and loads of families will be affected in different ways by it all. But ultimately, I think, you know, get lining up our theoretical political arguments around the concept of universal public housing as that's not the sole solution to the housing crisis, but it's the single biggest step that any government could take. And I think the job is to force Sinn Féin, the Social Democrats and Labour now onto the universal public housing space, and to force Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael onto the universal public housing space. And if they won't come onto that ground, it's to highlight the fact that they won't, and to expose and to pose the question, why will they not come onto that ground? Because when you won't have to scratch the fur, and I think Conor will, as someone who has some understanding of Sinn Féin like myself, will tell you, and the reason we're talking about Sinn Féin is because they are most likely the next government. It's not about just bashing Sinn Féin. The Shinners are terrified by the concept of scaring the horses. And the horses are the middle class voters that they're hoping to get first and high preference votes from, and international capital. And everything they do is kind of shaped by this fear of scaring the horses. And what we need to do is kind of build momentum around universal public housing to the point that the main political forces realize that they're out of step with the people, as opposed to being afraid that they're going to scare people by endorsing a progressive housing policy such as that. So, like, I don't think we need to wait to build a housing campaign until Sinn Féin have got the government and failed. I think we need to build it now, but we need to build it on the solid foundations, solid theoretical basis of what we're doing, and understand that in tackling housing and going for the big solution with housing, you're also going for the bankers, you're also going for the landlords, you're also going for that gambling class that's integrated into that, the estate agents, the legal profession, and that, again, it's big stuff, and hence why the Social Democrats won't go near it.
All right, I'll just bring in Conor now.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of answer answers their two questions. In terms of the Troika and the current crisis, it's kind of, they had an oblique influence on it, and it was mainly down to the fact that there was no kind of investment happening from 2011 until 2016, 2017. That wasn't entirely down to the Troika. What they said was that the Southern State had to spend kind of within its means, but it could raise its means by like raising taxes. And the South being a tax haven, it wouldn't do that. You had Tony O'Reilly, you had the health minister at the time, by coming out saying that Ireland's corporation tax rate, the tax rate was going to sacrosanct. So the blockage was that the state wanted to maintain being a tax haven, even though it was in a kind of IMF kind of program, So that's where the real kind of lack of money for investment kind of really happened. Also, what the Department of Finance will say is that they like the build to rent, or kind of renting off kind of these kind of funds, because it's all off balance sheet kind of spend. So that's the argument which they're going to put forward, which would tie into the kind of Troika rules, but it's quite weak. I just see that as them using the Troika to kind of justify their own profit seeking kind of strategies, which is around which is around keeping the South as a kind of tax haven, which doesn't invest, and that's what it's doing there. True. In terms of the asset bubbles and housing, that's the reason why they're moving into social housing. What kind of transnational capital has it copped on from the global 2008 kind of housing crisis? It was that how you avoid going bust is having a kind of guaranteed income stream, and the best kind of guaranteed kind of income stream for any kind of capital investment is social housing, because it's guaranteed by the state. It's a guaranteed. You're taking in kind of taxpayers' kind of money. So that's why, going back to kind of Bill Nolan, or William Nolan, who's the main kind of architect of the current form of institutional investment, in Ireland. He wrote a PhD on this. His PhD in 2018. I just kind of Googled it there. It's entitled "Institutional Investment in Social and Affordable Housing in Ireland." He's literally written a book about it, and it's about how to financialize social housing. And his big thing is, and all the main parties have bought into this, is the so-called affordable rent. That phrase, social housing, cost rental. These are all plans from transnational capital to make sure that when the next kind of asset bubble blows up, that they won't go under, because they have tapped into the social housing kind of stream. And he literally, he's put it in black and white. He's like the guy from the Fast Show. Don't leave that there. I'll just nick it. and no one kind of believes him and goes, "No, don't do that. I'm telling you, I'm a geezer. I'll just kind of steal from you." And then if you believe it there, and then he steals from them. Bill Nolan wrote a book about it. He wrote his PhD on this, saying how to monetize social housing. And, he's been kind of advising kind of NAMA and the state about how to do this just for the last kind of 5-6 years, So it's hiding in plain sight. And it is down to that thing around how to avoid the next kind of asset bubble bursting. Going back to, the kind of housing kind of campaign thing, the reason why I would argue for the whole kind of keeping the kind of grassroots and the streets is down to the experience of kind of repeal the eighth and right to water. Just going back to kind of Sinn Féin was for kind of water charges until it wasn't, until it saw that there was votes being kind of against it, and then it kind of turned the tide. It had to have 3 special Ardeshes to even get onto the same pages as Fine Gael on abortion, and lost kind of 2 of his TDs in the process. But what that tells me is that it will respond to pressure. And again, I mentioned Sinn Féin because it's on kind of 30% in the South. That hasn't dropped in 18 months. So barring some major kind of event, it does look like it will be leading the next kind of government. But it is acutely sensitive to kind of street pressure, and that's its weak link. And that should be exploited, especially on O'Brien, who, you know, he's a very nice guy, but like he is sensitive to kind of criticism on this whole kind of issue. And because he hasn't been kind of criticized and it hasn't been kind of analyzed, and just how kind of centrist the Sinn Féin housing policy really is, that there's great scope there for really kind of pushing pressure on the Conor O'Brien, who I think is a weak link in all of this because he is, you know, he lives on social media, you know. So, you know, so there is scope there for that. But the real thing is that when they are in power and is them and with a Fianna Fáil, you know, it's Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, Labour, suck down kind of government, that how you will keep kind of pressure on them is not going to be through lobbying their TDs. It's going to be numbers on the streets. So no matter what, that needs to be kind of worked on, because that for me is the only game in town, you know. So whatever kind of leads into that has to be positive.